Hello everyone. So my name is Giles Hamilton-Fletcher. I was actually present at the first event, Hack the Brain, as sort of like my first foray out of the University of Sussex. At that time I had just completed my PhD, walked out the Viva, and then later on in the week went straight to Hack the Brain to give like my first talk. Sort of like outside the university, but still sort of like within the realm of what I really want to, what I find absolutely fascinating about the senses. And the subject of the talk that I'll be giving today will really be on what I would consider to be the pioneers of sort of like developing new senses, at least as far as their own sort of personal realm of experience goes. People who have dedicated huge portions of their lives to actually sort of learning a new sense and really being the first on the front lines to sort of learn a new version of vision. Okay, so there are different areas of the brain which are primarily dedicated to processing sort of different sensory experiences. Now there are more than 5, but it sort of seems like there are different ways that you can cut off the number of senses that you want to talk about. And I think, just so that I don't go on and on and on, I think I'll just stop at 5. So there are areas of the brain which sort of like primarily dedicated to processing sort of taste, smell, touch, hearing, and sight. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is sort of like how we can have one sense take on the properties of another. So if we have a blind individual who no longer is able to, that's nice. Who no longer has access to visual information, can no longer pass visual information onto the visual cortex at the back of the brain. I'm interested in what happens is when we reprogram sights as sounds and then see if sort of like this information still manages to sort of muddle its way towards the appropriate area. I think some of you have got a sneak preview as to what the actual answer is. So the actual process of doing this is called sensory substitution, and it is basically just a systematic way that information normally associated with one sense is turned into those received by another. And this can be sort of like any combination of the senses. Besides the sort of like the 5 senses that I've listed here, for example, balance is one that is also done in sensory substitution, where you can sort of have like a balancing scale, either in your glasses, like with a spirit level, or on your tongue. So you can sort of like, you can break beyond these 5 senses and sort of like in really interesting ways. But for the purposes of these, we'll be focusing on the act of turning vision into sound. And so a sensory substitution device is simply, at least a visual sensory substitution device, simply a camera. I don't know what. Oh, that's the laser pointer. There's actually a camera in these glasses, and so that will get passed onto a computer that will turn that visual information into sound in a systematic manner, and then go back out to some earphones. And so you can end up linking visual dimensions to auditory ones. And so I think the first most interesting thing we can do is learn one of these devices ourselves. And so the device that we'll be learning, it's called the Voice, is quite ubiquitous within scientific research because it's freely available. You can download this, and what's really good is it's been around a while, which means that some individuals have been using it for a long time. And this is one of the individuals who've been using it for quite a few years, but we'll go on to her in a moment. And so, by linking one sense to another, so if we have, for example, the horizontal position in sight turned into panning between the ears, left side, right side, then it's quite an obvious relation, dimensions to link up. We can use pitch in order to indicate the height of something in the visual field, and we can use loudness to indicate how bright something is in the visual field. So if something's very bright, then it'll be very loud. If it's on the right side, it'll be in the right ear. If it's high up in space, it'll be a high-pitched sound. So those are 3 simple dimensions that you can use to sort of like have a visual-like experience, and 3 auditory dimensions you can use to translate that. And so, if we were to actually go through the process of learning the voice itself, you see this column that we have here. Now, basically, what happens is in this device, there's a column that sweeps from one side to the other. And anything that it touches, it turns into sound. And so, since there is effectively nothing here at the moment, you wouldn't hear anything. Then you would hear a low-pitched sound, a medium-pitched sound, a high-pitched sound, and then silence again. And so one would hope that there would be some audio output, but there isn't at the moment. So, there we go. So you can sort of hear the tone sort of like ascending in pitch. You try some different objects. And so what you can, one of the really interesting things about this is just the level of preservation of the visual signal in that sound. And so what happens is if you take an image, you turn it into sound using the voice, then you pick that up with a mic or you just put it into an audio program. And then if you view the resulting sound in a spectrogram, you're actually able to retain quite a lot of the visual information that is there. So you can sort of see like the areas of dark and light in that image, and so this image, this sound is now effectively within it. There is the ability to sort of like tell edges from one another, for example, and the location of objects. And so now sound effectively contains the rules of vision. The sound changes in accordance with what we would expect from vision, and so sounds now have effectively a field of view related to the camera. When something goes in front of the camera, now you can start to hear it. When it goes away from the camera, you can no longer hear it. And obviously it has properties such as occlusion. When something is obscured, you can no longer hear it. When something gets smaller, then it takes up less of sort of like the auditory bandwidth that you have there. When it changes its shape, then the sound will change as well, and the same when it's in sort of like in a bright room or a dark room, the resulting sounds, they all change. Because these changes are systematic, it is possible to sort of figure out what these auditory changes mean for the visual world in front of you. And so typically when these devices are used inside the lab, it's in very sort of simplistic environments. So you can identify objects from their shape, and so they have these unique sort of auditory signature that is associated with each of these objects. You could navigate past some obstacles, so long as like the obstacles and the actual sort of environment sort of like contrast with one another quite heavily. Or indeed you could try blind virtual reality, where you can effectively use your head movements and have the resulting sort of sounds. They're all sort of married up to one another, and you can figure out where objects are in this virtual world that you otherwise would not really have a great deal of access to. And what's really interesting is some people have actually been using the voice for a very long time. And the first person I want to talk about is Hamilton-Fletcher. And so she is a late blind individual. She had normal sight until the age of 21, and she was blinded by an industrial accident and has effectively minimal light perception at the moment. She's used the voice for 15 years, and so she's really sort of like a very interesting person because she obviously knows what sight is. She can compare it to what the resulting experiences are that she has after using the voice for 15 years. And so this will all come on to some of the topics I want to talk about later, but first of all, sort of like why did Pat actually pick up the voice? And she wanted a way to identify colours of clothing in her wardrobe. And so it's quite a sort of like a mundane task, but something that spurred her on to try some of these sensory translation devices. And she really sort of like had no idea as to sort of like what she was getting herself in for at this stage. It's a fairly simple task that she wanted to be able to solve again, and so she tried this device, and it didn't just sort of like, it didn't, there is actually like some colour that can be done with the voice. It simply speaks the colour, but actually sort of smuggled in like quite a large amount of vision into this, when actually what she wanted was really just like a colour sensor. And over time, over using these devices, She reports she reports visual experiences resulting from these sounds. And so, quote from her: "She'll never forget the shock and awe. I'll never forget the shock and joy of limping down the hallway and seeing blinds hanging from the window. Such a simple sight, yet after 20 years of blindness, I was overwhelmed. I can see." And so, it's quite. Although we've been talking about sort of some areas related to sensory substitutions being quite cold, it's like actually given enough time, like these can be quite overwhelming as well. And so another quote from her, like whether or not this is just sounds that she's responding to, is just sounds. No, it is far more. It is sight. There is true light perception generated by the voice. And the brain is an inference machine. It will effectively try to fill in whatever gaps there are in the sensory signals. And so she's being fed a 2D black and white image every second. And from this, as long as you sort of like you move the device in the environment, you can get some clues as to sort of like how far objects are away by how much they move in your visual field as you sort of like look left and right, as you sort of peer in. How much does the sound signal change? How if you peer out? And these are things which took a long time to sort of come online for her. Depth isn't hard-coded into the device; it's something that she has to infer from it, from these 2D signals. And I've developed it to where one day I was washing dishes, and without thinking, I grabbed the towel, washed my hands, and looked down into the sink to make sure that the water had got out. And I realised, oh, I can see down. I can see depth. Furthermore, she effectively has an image every second. But her brain has started filling in that sort of time in between each second. It stops being effectively living life through a PowerPoint presentation into sort of living life through like a pretend smooth presentation. So her mind just redraws the difference of the image. There's no time lag. I don't see the second break anymore. It's totally gone. And she's being fed black and white information, but once again the inference machine is at work. And she started sort of colour has started infiltrating her visual experience, despite the fact she's only seeing the world through sort of like in grayscale. Over time, my brain seems to have developed and pulled out everything it can from the soundscape, and then used my memory to colour everything. And so when she recognises objects like from the visual shapes, and just sort of like what she would expect to be there, she will colour it in sort of congruently with what you would expect. So a Christmas tree would be sort of coloured in green with the various sort of like elements put onto it. But when it comes to something where she doesn't have a great understanding of, she's been blind for a very long time, she hasn't had a huge amount of computer experience when it comes to computer monitors, keyboards, things like that she's less familiar with from a sighted perspective, she's not able to fill in as much detail, so she doesn't have that model to sort of like apply to the image that she's getting. And so after 15 years of use, you would expect it to change her brain a fair amount. And so we have sight being turned into hearing, goes to the auditory cortex, and sort of wondering whether it goes to the visual cortex. We saw earlier that it activates the visual cortex through some MRI scans, but it's also possible to prove that this is sort of like an essential part of her visual experience using the voice by effectively temporarily disrupting her visual cortex. And so you can do this via something called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which effectively is like a fluctuating magnetic field that basically introduces noise into the system. So if you imagine you have like a coherent TV signal, you start adding in noise and you can't figure out what it is anymore. This is effectively what you're doing to the back of someone's brain. And she actually had this done to her a little while back and has an interesting quote. So the TMS was turned on and the world started getting darker, like someone slowly turning down the lights. I couldn't see anything. And I've omitted it from here, but actually she expressed a huge amount of concern that the experimenters had broken her sight and that she was extremely worried that her sight wouldn't come back online. And so you could say she's obviously sort of grown very attached to perceiving the world in this way and what it gives her. And so we already knew that this would be the case, but minutes later her sight returned. And we have a few other experts that have also used the voice. This is Pranav Lal. He is a blind photographer. He runs a blog where he sort of like he takes photos using the voice and then sort of like comments on them on his holidays. And he's early blind, so he doesn't really have a lot of experience in vision. He's got minimal light perception, and he chooses his images not in the way that like a traditional photographer would choose their image based on sort of like its visual aesthetic qualities, but rather he chooses it through its auditory aesthetic qualities. So his pictures have to sound nice, otherwise he's not interested. And it's funny because he actually, a lot of his pictures are actually really, really good. Sort of with these, it has lots of different sort of elements, and if you imagine these being turned into sound, all of these will be related to tones, like going up in pitch, and various sort of bleeps and bloops as you go through, and it has a very sort of like defined shape. And so, much like the last shape that you tried with the voice, with this sort of like, you would have that as well, sort of going on. And also sort of like visually complicated pictures are quite interesting because they produce a very sort of like complicated auditory soundscape that he finds very interesting. Also, another individual who's been using it for a very long time, once again, early blind, minimal light perception, Claire Cheskin. And she was taken by BBC Horizon to try her voice on different sort of sights and sounds of London. And so she was taken to see the London Eye, and she's described it, oh, that's weird, a curved thing with little dots on it. And it's sort of quite a bizarre, must be quite a bizarre experience to sort of like experience the London Eye for the first time through sound, through the voice, and be like, why is there this giant circle in the sky with dots on it? I hope it's not an alien invasion, you know. Other things a little bit more generic, she's quite happily able to sort of figure out that, okay, that's just a column sort of like ascending into the sky. And for these last two individuals, they haven't had extensive experience of vision, and so they are effectively learning it from the ground up. This is, as you might expect, quite a difficult thing. And so they've effectively all had to learn to see again for the first time, and to learn these rules of vision that I talked about earlier when it comes to perspective, when it comes to occlusion, when it comes to depth and all those things. And she during this ride in the taxi, where she's being taken around to all these different areas of London, she said, when I first started using it, I said it looks like there's a car driving right up the side of the building. Things are happening that are impossible. I'm going into the twilight zone. Because I hadn't learned to see perspective. And then I had to learn to see. And there are a few other sort of like instances that I've heard talked about that I thought were quite interesting. Pranav Lal, he had some home remodeling done, and he wanted to understand what the architect was talking about. And so they fed in the architect's AutoCAD drawing through the voice. And one of the things that he became very interested in was a spiral staircase, and it has a sort of like, if you were to turn that into sound, that would have a very unique sort of auditory signature. It's very complicated, but there are very clear patterns that are going on in this. And when it came to the actual sort of finished construction of this house, you remember sort of looking at this finished spiral staircase, and that it produced the same sound as the AutoCAD drawing. It had the same pattern embedded in it. And it sticks out in his mind as to sort of like this kind of how something sort of like 2D and abstract and virtual could relate to the real world. He's never had access to anything like that before. And then sort of seeing it as sort of like a 3D representation in front of him is quite a sort of special event for him. One of the things that happens though with these three sort of like long-term users, these pioneers, is that they all report that it takes a lot of effort to learn these. The process was very slow and time-consuming. I often stood on the threshold of giving up. It takes a lot of time and effort to be able to interpret the voice effectively. It took 3 months for me to learn enough so that I didn't have to consciously concentrate on it. If you imagine learning a skill solidly for 3 months before it becomes an automatic skill, these are... You can invest 3 months into a whole variety of skills. You can learn piano, you can learn so many different things. But they've decided to stick with the voice and see where it takes them. But there's a huge upfront cost associated with using some devices. And so long-term adoption, like for me at least, yields these impressive results. But there's only a handful of long-term users. It's very, as far as sort of like ambassadors for using sensory substitution goes, there's pretty much just enough that I can count them on one hand. However, I also know that around 60,000 visually impaired users have downloaded the voice, and so that's quite a discrepancy, which is kind of worrying. And I'm kind of thinking this upfront cost that is required is too much for virtually everyone. And so a lot of the research that I've been doing at Sussex has been looking at how can we improve this sort of these long-term adoption rates by helping the first like initial impressions of these devices. And so we did a study where we interviewed 10 visually impaired persons after they tried out 3 sensory substitution devices. It's all well and good sort of talking about sensory substitution devices over the internet with people who've never tried them, but you're not quite sure if you're speaking the same language. And so we wanted to make sure that everyone sort of like had the same standards from which they could speak about these devices and not sort of get carried away with what they hope will be in the future. And so we created 3 devices. The first is a depth voice, which is simply the voice as you sort of heard it so far, but it's applied to depth information. What's really useful about that is it segments the world into these really nice shapes. We have a second device called the synestheater, and this does a very similar thing. You have a complex world, you turn it into these sort of simple sort of like shapes based on how close things are, so we have very simple information. And then we turn those into musical sounds that feel like they're being emanated from these objects. And we have something called the Creole, which is a colour to sound translator. And so what this does is it turns a single colour into sounds using principles that we sort of we figured out from synesthesia, from cross-modal correspondences. So like there is a sound for redness, a sound for yellow, for blue, and everything. But I want to show you one of the speakers that we have upcoming. So this will have some sounds.
So basically what I hear from the device is like a table tennis match. So you can imagine that the ping pong ball is bouncing on the table on the left, then when it hits the right side of the table, it just bounces back directly. And this system is called depth voice. It's quite easy to pick the stereo shift, so I can hear either in my left ear or in my right ear or somewhere in between. And the vertical position is illustrated by the pitch of the sound, so how high the sound gets and how low it gets depending on the height of the object. What I can do with the technology is to pick the shape of people fairly easily. So for example, if somebody just stands in front of me, that's very easy, it's just I can hear like a vertical call more or less. And then if somebody, for example, puts their left arm up, I can hear that as well, based on the change in sound. Now if they put the arm down and they decide to put the other arm up, then I can hear the change in the shape as well. At the moment, this technology is perhaps not yet capable of picking up fast-moving objects, for example, a person walking across. However, another device called the synestheater is very much capable of doing that. The synestheater picks up really quickly the change in situation. So if somebody was going to walk in front of me from right to left, let's say, this time, I could hear that instantaneously. For me, personally, when I first had a chance to see this tablet called Creole, I thought this is really cool because it was giving me a very good intuition of what really different colors are like. As I move my cursor along, I can instantly pick up the sounds of different colors. I know approximately how the colors of the rainbow go. So I can feel the sound of red, and I can feel blue, which is my favorite color or favorite sound, I should say. and I can just discover the whole palette and fairly easily memorize all the sounds and associate with the colors. I was sighted, I had perfect sight until the age of 6, and then for some medical reasons my sight started to deteriorate, and it went down and further down all the way until I was age 16, and then that's where I lost my vision completely. I couldn't detach and I can't sense light since then, so for the last 6 years, I'm completely blind. That was a big change, but I have faith in technology. Maybe one day I can get sight back, maybe not naturally, but using some kind of technology.
So that's Daniel Hadges, and he'll be giving one of the talks next month. So yeah, you have a little preview from him. So we talked to 10 blind individuals who. So we talked to 10 blind individuals about what was sort of important to them as far as sort of like trying a device for the first time, and I have a few different things which they sort of gave us as feedback. And the first most important thing is probably the auditory aesthetics, that it is initially very pleasing to use. Visual information, it's difficult to see the beauty in visual information to begin with if you're not quite sure what the device does. You haven't figured out how you interact with the device, how the device interacts with the world. Just the very first impression, just sort of has to sound pleasant, has to be something which you can listen to for say 30 minutes without it getting sort of irritating. Second thing is the actual sort of design aesthetics. So the idea that you have a device that looks very cool, that it looks very, you want to show it off to your friends. You want to be the person who everyone else is being like, oh my god, what's that? There was an interviewee who had a watch called the Bradley, which is very interesting. It's a visually impaired watch. We have ball bearings that are going around like a castle-like structure. And in order to get the time, you would put your hand over that. But besides that, you can also just flip the ball bearings around and then they'll return to the correct time. So it's just kind of cool. And one of our interviewees was extremely into fashion, and so he had one of these watches, and it opens up conversations a lot of the time, and it gets people to talk about what they're interested in. Also responsiveness of the device, and so with the voice, it's sort of it updates every second, but that's quite a long time. If you have a device that sort of instantly changes, then people get a much better handle on what is happening with the device and how it's interacting with the environment. Also that it's easy to learn, so these are using sort of intuitive sort of associations that we have between the senses, for example. So if we use sort of what we know about cross-modal correspondences and we put those into devices, then that should aid in how easy to learn they are. The important footnote is, of course, early blind individuals and late blind individuals might not have the same correspondences. The pitch height mapping might not be true for early blind individuals, for example. The device has to be low effort. They don't want to be able to concentrate on it. It should sort of be simple enough and immediate enough that they're able to effectively just incorporate it in their day-to-day sort of activities. If they have to concentrate on one device, that means they're not concentrating on something else, and that's really bad. If you need to listen out for subtle auditory cues as to what's going on in your environment. Also, people aren't interested in devices that effectively are too overt. A lot of individuals want to have the control over the ability of how they look, and if you have a device which is huge or something that shows that I'm a blind individual, that's something that not everyone wants to publicly display, and they want to have control over how obvious it is to other people. And also, obviously, sort of free up the ears. So there's something you can use called bone conduction, and I have some of the devices I have set up will be able to output using this. Effectively, what this does is it vibrates in an area next to your ears. It sounds like sound, but you can also use your ears normally as well. And so, when it comes to what people actually want to use these devices for, people a lot of our interviewees were interested in sort of like in independently doing a variety of things. So independently working with colour, independently navigating so they don't have to rely on other people, and sort of like using it at work. But also sort of social inclusion. So the idea that you can sense some aspects of your environment that you can bring up in conversation and discuss with the people around you. Our fashion inclined interviewee said that when my friends meet, they might say, "Oh, that's a nice jacket," and that's the sort of thing I could miss. It's just in my personality. That's something that I would recognise and comment on if only I could see it. So for him, it's an additional access into a whole realm of conversation that they want to partake in, but they maybe don't have the ability to off the bat. And then finally, just sort of expanding the horizons. We saw earlier on people sort of interpreting architecture. That's something that's very difficult to do if you sort of start for a huge object that you don't have the ability to sort of like feel a smaller version of it and then sort of like infer what the larger version is like. That this is sort of a fast way of inferring what shape like buildings are and things like that, and to sort of go beyond their normal sort of like routes through life. So if they're sort of travelling around with a cane and just knowing what's beyond the fence, knowing what else is around them on their normal sort of walking routes is something that was of interest to a lot of these individuals. And a final sort of quote, which sort of gets to the heart of it, is that words don't convey visual information, that you need to experience it. And so, yeah, I invite you all to experience the variety of devices that we brought down. We brought down Depth Voice, Synestheatre, and another one which is called the Inactive Torch. And so some of those are set up already, and I'll set up one on that computer.